Welcome to a journey into one of the most unsettling and mysterious cases ever recorded in the history of Georgia. Before we begin, I invite you to share in the comments where you're watching from and the exact time you're listening to this narration. We're always fascinated to see where these forgotten accounts reach and at what strange hours they're heard around the world. In the autumn of 1837, a series of unexplained disappearances began to disturb the quiet routines of Chatham County, Georgia. At first, the cases seemed unrelated. A traveling salesman who never arrived at his destination, a young woman who vanished while seeking employment, isolated tragedies in a region still half wilderness. But over time, every trail, every rumor, every unanswered question led back to a single place, the Harwood Estate, an imposing property set against the edge of a sprawling marshland 15 miles south of Savannah. The estate belonged to Eleanor Harwood, who had inherited her family's fortune following the death of her father, Judge Thaddeus Harwood, one of Georgia's most respected legal minds. Known among Savannah's elite as a woman of grace and intellect, Eleanor was celebrated for hosting lavish dinners beneath chandeliers that gleamed like stars over the deep southern night. Guests described her as a model of refinement, a hostess whose charm could disarm even the most critical observer. Yet, behind that polished reputation lay a darker reality. The grand, oak-lined drive leading to the Harwood mansion seemed to mark an invisible border, a threshold beyond which the ordinary rules of law and decency no longer applied. It was said in hushed tones that once you crossed those gates, you entered a place where status determined worth, and where the line between guest and possession grew dangerously blurred. According to county records from 1837, 7 individuals were officially reported missing between September and December. At the time, no links were drawn between the cases. Each disappearance was filed away with a similar note. Investigation conducted, no evidence found. Officials blamed bandits, river accidents, or the hazards of frontier travel, the sorts of explanations that allowed uncomfortable questions to rest quietly in the dark. But nearly a century later, in 1963, a discovery would breathe new life into the mystery. During the renovation of an old caretaker's cottage, once belonging to the Harwood Estate, workers uncovered a leather-bound journal, its pages yellowed and its ink fading with age. The book had belonged to Thomas Reading, the Harwood family's former groundskeeper. The journal's handwriting was authenticated against employment records preserved in the Chatham County archives, and for a brief period, it caused a stir among local historians. The diary was later sealed within the Emory University archives after an internal review that curiously ended without a published conclusion. At first glance, Reading's journal appeared harmless, daily notes about weather, crop yields, and the comings and goings of estate staff. But beginning in late August of 1837, his tone shifted. The entries became tense, observant, fearful. The mundane details gave way to something else entirely. A series of accounts hinting at strange noises from the marsh, unusual orders from Miss Harwood, and midnight visitors who never left by morning. Reading writes of strange sounds coming from the East Wing cellar and guests who arrive but never seem to leave through the front gates. He describes his employer, Eleanor Harwood, as changing. There is something in her eyes now that wasn't there before. A passage dated September 23, 1837 reads, "Miss Harwood requested I prepare the old storage rooms in the East Wing. When I asked what for, she merely smiled and said for long-term guests. I've been instructed to reinforce the doors and add new locks. The carpenter was told to install smaller windows, too small for a person to fit through. I don't like this work. I don't like it at all." Eleanor Harwood was 32 years old in 1837, unmarried despite numerous suitors, and had been managing the family estate since her father's death 5 years prior. County tax records show the Harwood Plantation was one of the most profitable in the region, producing rice and cotton through the labor of more than 100 enslaved persons. Eleanor's father had been known as a harsh but not unusually cruel slave owner by the standards of the time. What local historians have found unusual, however, was Eleanor's management style after her father's death. According to ledgers kept by the plantation overseer William Hughes, Eleanor took a far more direct and personal interest in the discipline of the enslaved workers than most women of her station typically would. Hughes' records indicate that Eleanor would often observe punishments and occasionally dictate specific methods. One entry from 1836 simply states, "Miss Harwood insisted on being present for the whipping of Jonah. She watched without expression." Afterward, she told me it was insufficient and had me continue until the man could no longer stand. I have never seen such coldness in a lady. These documents paint a picture of a woman who, behind the veneer of Southern gentility, harbored a disturbing fascination with power and control. But it wasn't until the autumn of 1837 that Ella Lenina's darker inclinations apparently evolved into something far more sinister. According to Reading's Journal, the first special guest arrived in late September, a young man who had come to the estate seeking employment as a tutor. He was ushered into the main house and, according to Reading, was served dinner with Ella Lenina in the formal dining room. Reading wrote, "The young man, Mr. Sullivan from Boston, seemed impressed by Miss Harwood's knowledge of literature and philosophy. She was most charming. After dinner, she asked me to bring brandy to the study. That was the last time I saw Mr. Sullivan in the main house. 3 days later, I heard sounds coming from the East Wing cellar like someone pounding on wood." Over the next 3 months, Reading documented 6 more individuals who came to the estate: a female seamstress, a male art dealer from Charleston, a young woman answering an advertisement for a lady's companion, a land surveyor, and 2 people whose occupations were not noted. In each case, the pattern was the same. They were received graciously, dined with Ella Lenina, and then seemingly vanished, but they hadn't left the property. Reading's Journal suggests that Ella Lenina had created her own private collection of people, individuals who were neither family nor traditional servants, but who occupied a terrible new category she had devised. "Today I was instructed to deliver food to the East Wing," Reading wrote in late October. "Miss Harwood unlocked the series of doors herself. I saw them, 3 of them at that point, in separate rooms. They were dressed in plain white garments like hospital gowns. Their heads were shaved. They did not speak as we entered. They kept their eyes downcast. Miss Harwood referred to them as her private collection and said she was improving them through discipline. I was forbidden to speak of what I had seen." The journal indicates that Ella Lenina had developed an elaborate system of rules and punishments for her captives. They were forced to memorize poems, passages from books, or musical compositions which they would have to recite or perform perfectly upon demand. Failures resulted in what Reading obliquely refers to as corrections. He never details these punishments explicitly, but his revulsion is clear in passages where he describes hearing sounds no human should make and finding blooded rags when he was ordered to clean certain rooms. What makes the Harwood case particularly disturbing is the calculated nature of Ella Lenina's actions. This was not a crime of passion or momentary madness, but a methodically executed series of abductions and imprisonment. She selected her victims carefully, people who were transient, who would not be immediately missed, who had come to her seeking something: employment, patronage, or business. She used her social position as a shield, knowing that few would question the comings and goings at the estate of one of Savannah's most prominent families. The climate of the pre-Civil War South created the perfect conditions for Ella Lenina's crimes. The institution of slavery had already established a social hierarchy where certain humans could legally own others. In this environment, Ella Lenina's actions, while still criminal, represented an extension of an already morally corrupt system rather than a complete aberration. She simply applied to white visitors the same principles of ownership and control that society had normalized for enslaved black individuals. The question that has haunted researchers is why. What drove this wealthy, educated woman to create her own private prison? Reading's Journal offers some clues. He recalls overhearing a conversation between Ella Lenina and her captive art dealer in which she said, "In here you exist solely according to my design. Outside these walls, you were subject to the random chaos of an indifferent world. Isn't there comfort in knowing exactly what is expected of you, in being entirely known by another?" This suggests that for Ella Lenina, her actions may have stemmed from a pathological desire for complete control, not merely over the bodies of others, as slave owners had, but over their minds, talents, and spirits as well. She seems to have fancied herself as a kind of sculptor of human beings, reshaping them according to her vision. December brought a bitter cold to coastal Georgia, unusual for the region. Reading's Journal entries become more frantic during this period. He describes how Ella Lenina's behavior grew increasingly erratic. She began spending entire days in the East Wing with her captives. The regular functioning of the plantation was neglected as she focused her attention on what she reportedly called her true purpose. On December 12th, Reading writes of a disturbing incident. "Miss Harwood summoned me to the East Wing after midnight. She was in a state I had never seen. Her hair undone, her dress spattered with something dark. She was ranting about one of them being defective and resistant to improvement. She ordered me to help her move it from the room. I found the young woman who had come as a seamstress lying on the floor. She did not appear to be breathing. When I reached to check, Miss Harwood struck my hand away and said, "It's not your concern if the material is flawed. We wrapped the body in canvas. I was instructed to bury it in the North Marsh, where the ground doesn't freeze. This appears to be the first death among Elenina's captives, but reading's subsequent entries suggest it was not the last." By late December, he writes of being unable to sleep, tormented by what he had witnessed and his own complicity. He writes, "I have become a monster by association. My hands are not clean. May God forgive me for what I have allowed to happen." The final entry in Reading's journal is dated January 3rd, 1838. It reads simply, "I can bear this no longer. I have written everything down should someone inquire into these evil deeds. I leave this place tonight. May God have mercy on my soul, for I have dwelled in the house of the devil." What happened to Thomas Reading after he fled the Harwood estate remains unknown. No records of him have been found in Chatham County or surrounding areas after 1838. Some historians speculate that he may have changed his name and moved north, desperate to escape the horrors he had witnessed. Others suggest a more grim fate, that perhaps Elenina Harwood discovered his documentation of her crimes and ensured he would never speak of them. As for Elenina Harwood herself, county records indicate that she continued to live at the estate until 1842, when a fire destroyed much of the main house and the east wing entirely. Newspaper accounts from the Savannah Republican describe how the fire began in the middle of the night and spread quickly through the wooden structures. Elenina survived, but 3 unidentified individuals were reported to have perished in the blaze. The newspaper account describes them only as household members with no further explanation of who they might have been. After the fire, Elenina left Georgia. Property records show she sold what remained of the estate and moved to Charleston, South Carolina, where she reportedly lived a quiet and reclusive life until her death in 1859. No legal charges were ever brought against her. Her crimes, if Reading's account is to be believed, remained hidden, known only through his journal discovered more than a century later. The remains of the Harwood estate were gradually reclaimed by the marsh. By 1963, when Reading's journal was discovered, nothing remained of the main house or the infamous East Wing. Archaeological surveys conducted in 1965 revealed some foundation stones and burned timber, but no human remains were recovered despite a search of the area described as the North Marsh in Reading's account. The case of Elenina Harwood represents a dark chapter in Georgia's history, one that went undocumented in official records and survives only through one man's private writings. It speaks to the ways in which power and privilege could shield even the most heinous actions from scrutiny, and how the dehumanizing institution of slavery created a moral framework in which someone like Elenina could extend the concept of human ownership to a new and personal level of horror. In the winter of 1967, a graduate student at Emory University named Margaret Collins was reportedly granted access to Reading's journal for a dissertation on crime in the Antebellum South. According to university records, Collins spent several weeks studying the document before suddenly abandoning her research and withdrawing from the university program entirely. When contacted by a local newspaper for a story on historic Savannah homes in 1968, Collins refused to discuss the Harwood case, saying only some history should remain buried, some minds should not be understood. The journal itself was last confirmed to be in the Emory University Special Collections in 1969. A request to examine it in 1971 returned the information that the document had been misplaced during cataloging. Subsequent searches have failed to locate it. Whether this represents a simple clerical error or something more deliberate remains unknown. What we are left with are fragments of a story about a woman who took the already reprehensible institution of human ownership and twisted it into something even more personally horrific. A woman who used her social position to create a private world where she could reshape human beings according to her design. A woman who, by all accounts, was never brought to justice for her crimes. The marshlands south of Savannah have changed dramatically since Elenina Harwood's time. Development has claimed much of what was once wilderness, but locals still speak of a certain area 15 miles south of the city that remains strangely undeveloped. The land there is said to be sour. Nothing grows right, buildings don't last. Some attribute this to the environmental conditions of the marsh. Others familiar with the Harwood story suggest a different cause. A local Galajici elder interviewed for a cultural preservation project in 1966 offered perhaps the most fitting epitaph for the Harwood case. Some places remember what happened there long after people try to forget. Some evil seeps into the soil and stays. That's why nothing grows right in that bend of the marsh. That's why the birds don't sing there. The land remembers what was done even when the records don't. The story of Elenina Harwood and her collection serves as a stark reminder of how the darkest human impulses can flourish when unchecked by accountability. When one person is given absolute power over others, and when society creates a moral framework that allows for the ownership of human beings in any form. As the sun sets over the marshlands south of Savannah, one might look at the tall grasses swaying in the coastal breeze and wonder how many other stories remain hidden there, known only to the land that witnessed them. How many other crimes were shielded by privilege, by remoteness, by the complicity of those who knew but remained silent? And how many other Thomas readings carried the weight of their knowledge to unmarked graves, leaving only fading journals as testament to horrors that official history has forgotten? If you ever find yourself driving south from Savannah along the old coastal road, you might pass a stretch of marsh that seems somehow darker than the rest, where the usual chorus of frogs and insects falls strangely silent. Some say that's all that remains of the Harwood estate, not its physical structures, but the echo of suffering that no amount of time can fully erase. A silence that speaks volumes to those willing to listen. A reminder that some chapters of our history were written not in public records, but in private nightmares. In 1968, a survey team working on a highway expansion project reported finding what appeared to be the remains of a small structure approximately where the Harwood East Wing would have stood. According to their field notes, they discovered a section of stone foundation and beneath it, a small sealed room containing several pairs of iron restraints anchored to the walls. The discovery was reported to the County Historical Society, but before a proper archaeological investigation could be conducted, the site was bulldozed as part of the ongoing construction. Whether this was due to bureaucratic oversight or deliberate obscuration remains unclear. The Harwood case reminds us that history is not just what is written in official documents or taught in classrooms. It is also composed of whispers, of stories too disturbing to be widely shared, of truths that powerful people work to conceal. Sometimes the most revealing historical documents are those that were never meant to be historical at all. Private journals, letters, the unguarded thoughts of those who witnessed darkness firsthand. Thomas Reading's final known words, scratched hastily on the last page of his journal, serve as both warning and lament. I have seen what becomes of a person who believes others exist merely for their use. I have seen how such a mind works, how it justifies, how it transforms atrocity into purpose. And I fear not just for those who fell into her hands, but for my own soul tainted by proximity to such evil. Some sins cannot be undone. Some memories cannot be escaped. May God have mercy on us all. The story of the Harwood estate and Elenina's collection has never been fully verified beyond Reading's account. It exists in that shadowy realm between documented history and dark legend. But perhaps that is where the most unsettling truths often reside, not in what can be definitively proven, but in what we fear might be true, in the possibility that behind the elegant facades of antebellum mansions, behind the carefully maintained veneer of southern gentility, there lurked horrors that few were brave enough to record and fewer still were willing to remember. As night falls over the Georgia marshlands, as the mist rises from the ground where the Harwood estate once stood, one might wonder in a society that permitted the ownership of human beings, what other perversions of humanity might have flourished in the shadows. What other Eleanors might have existed, their deeds unrecorded, their victims unremembered. The wind through the marsh grasses sometimes sounds like whispers, like voices just below the threshold of understanding. Perhaps they are just the natural sounds of the coastal wilderness, or perhaps they are echoes of those who were erased not just from life, but from history itself, those who entered the grand front doors of the Harwood estate as guests and found themselves transformed into possessions, their very humanity denied by a woman who saw people as materials to be shaped by her will. In the end, the most haunting aspect of the Harwood case may not be what we know, But what remains forever hidden, buried in unmarked graves, lost in uncatalogued archives, or consumed by the fire that ultimately claimed the East Wing and its secrets. Some doors, once opened, can never be fully closed again. Some knowledge changes those who possess it. Just ask Thomas Reading, who fled into the night and disappeared from history, carrying the burden of what he had witnessed. Just ask Margaret Collins, who abandoned her academic career rather than continue to delve into the darkness of Elalina Harwood's mind. Some histories, it seems, are too heavy to carry, some truths too disturbing to face, and so they remain in the shadows, half remembered, half forgotten, like the Harwood estate itself, claimed by marsh and memory, a place where evil was done but justice never came. The land remembers. Even when people try to forget, the marsh keeps its secrets. And somewhere in the swaying grasses and dark waters south of Savannah, the echoes of Elalina Harwood's collection remain, a warning about the darkest possibilities that lurk within the human heart when power goes unchecked and when one person is given dominion over another. Next time you drive through Georgia, pay attention to those places that feel somehow wrong, where the birds don't sing, where the air feels heavy with unspoken history. Some might say it's just the natural melancholy of the marsh. Others might suggest it's the weight of all that has happened there, all that has gone unacknowledged, unjudged, and unatoned for. Either way, listen carefully. The past is never truly silent for those willing to hear. In the spring of 1964, a local historian named Robert Caldwell began interviewing elderly residents of Chatham County about their family histories. Among those he spoke with was Abigail Mercer, then 92 years old, whose grandmother had been a house servant at a neighboring plantation to the Harwood estate. According to Caldwell's notes, Mercer recounted stories her grandmother had told about Miss Elalina and her special rooms. "My grandmama told me that the house slaves at Harwood wouldn't go near the East Wing," Mercer reportedly said. "They said Miss Elalina had people in there that weren't slaves but weren't free neither. People who came as visitors and then never left. The house slaves could hear them sometimes trying to recite poems or play the piano at all hours of the night. If they made a mistake, there would be silence and then sounds that made the house slaves cover their ears and pray." Mercer's account aligned disturbingly well with Reading's journal, despite the fact that the journal had not been made public at the time of her interview. This convergence of narratives from different sources lends credibility to the horrific picture they paint. Another piece of evidence emerged in 1966 when a collection of letters was discovered during the renovation of an old law office in Savannah. The correspondence, dating from 1839 to 1841, was between Judge William Crawford of the Chatham County Court and his colleague in Charleston. In one letter dated June 12, 1840, Crawford makes a passing reference to Elalina Harwood. "I encountered Miss Harwood at the Morrisons' dinner last evening. There is something in her demeanor that unsettles me profoundly. She spoke at length about her theories on human nature and discipline, how some people are meant to be guided while others are meant to guide. When I mentioned the strange rumors about guests at her estate who are never seen to leave, she merely smiled and said, 'My hospitality is simply too compelling for some to resist.' There was something in her eyes as she said this that chilled me to my core. I find myself wondering if there is truth to the whispers, but her family name and fortune make direct inquiry impossible without substantial evidence." The letter suggests that even in her own time, Elalina's activities had generated suspicion among certain members of Savannah society. Yet her wealth and social position created a shield that prevented serious investigation. Judge Crawford's reluctance to pursue the rumors without substantial evidence speaks to the power dynamics that allowed Elalina's crimes to continue unchecked. Perhaps the most disturbing evidence came to light in 1967 when an archaeological team from the University of Georgia conducted a survey of the former Harwood property. While most of the estate had been reclaimed by the marsh, the team discovered what appeared to be the remains of a small cemetery approximately half a mile from where the main house had stood. The location matched Reading's description of the North Marsh, where he had been instructed to bury the body of the seamstress. The team's report indicates they found the remains of at least 4 individuals buried in unmarked graves. The skeletons showed signs consistent with poor nutrition and in at least 2 cases evidence of healed fractures that suggested repeated physical trauma. Most tellingly, one grave contained the remains of a woman in her early 20s wearing the remnants of a simple white garment and a single thimble clutched in her hand, possibly identifying her as the seamstress mentioned in Reading's account. Due to the limited archaeological techniques available in 1967 and the poor preservation conditions of the marsh, detailed analysis of the remains was difficult. The university's report was filed with the State Historical Society, but never published. When a journalist attempted to follow up on the findings in 1969, he was informed that the remains had been buried in a Savannah cemetery and that the case was considered closed due to the age of the potential crimes and the lack of living suspects. The abrupt conclusion of both the academic study of Reading's journal and the archaeological investigation has led some to speculate about a deliberate suppression of the Harwood story. Descendants of prominent Savannah families, some with connections to the Harwoods through marriage or business, held considerable influence in Georgia politics and academia in the 1960s. It is not inconceivable that pressure could have been applied to minimize a story that cast a shadow over their ancestral legacy. But perhaps the most compelling reason for the case's obscurity is simpler. The horror of what Elenina Harwood did represents a particularly disturbing evolution of the already reprehensible institution of slavery. It serves as an uncomfortable reminder that the moral framework that allowed for human ownership created conditions where even more personal and idiosyncratic forms of domination could flourish. Elenina Harwood took the central premise of slavery that one human could own another and adapted it to suit her own psychological needs. Rather than exploiting people primarily for economic gain as traditional slave owners did, she collected them for her personal entertainment and satisfaction. She created a private world where she could exercise absolute control, reshaping her captives according to her own vision of what they should be. This represents a form of evil that is difficult to categorize or comprehend. It exists at the intersection of institutional injustice and individual pathology, where the corrupt values of a society enable the darkest impulses of an individual to find expression. In 1968, a psychology professor from the University of North Carolina reviewed what was known of the Harwood case as part of a study on historical examples of captivity and control. His assessment was both clinical and chilling. What makes the Harwood case particularly disturbing is the apparent absence of traditional motivations for such crimes. There is no evidence of sexual sadism, financial gain, or conventional revenge. Instead, we see something more abstract, a fascination with dominion itself, with the reshaping of human beings according to one's personal aesthetic. In many ways, this represents a more profound negation of others' humanity than even traditional slavery, as it reduced people not to instruments of production, but to objects of personal artistic expression. This framing helps explain why the Harwood case remains so unsettling, even by the standards of historical atrocities. Eleanor didn't just deny her victims their freedom. She sought to erase and rewrite their very identities. The white garments, the shaved heads, the forced performances and recitations all suggest an attempt to strip away individuality and replace it with her own vision of what these people should be. In this light, the east wing of the Harwood estate represents not just a physical prison, but an ontological one, a place where people were not merely confined, but fundamentally redefined according to another's will. Fragments of this story have occasionally surfaced in popular culture. A 1972 novel titled The Collector's Rooms drew loose inspiration from the Harwood case, though it transplanted the setting to New England and added supernatural elements absent from the historical accounts. A 1989 documentary on unsolved crimes in the American South included a brief segment on the Harwood case, but was criticized by historians for sensationalizing the limited evidence and drawing unsupported conclusions. In 2006, a graduate student at Georgia State University attempted to revive academic interest in the case as part of a thesis on hidden histories of the Antebellum South. A request to access any remaining documentation from the 1960s investigations were denied, with university administrators citing privacy concerns despite the passage of more than 160 years since the events in question. This pattern of initial interest followed by institutional resistance has characterized the Harwood case throughout its limited historiography. It is as if the story itself generates a kind of discomfort that makes both academic and popular audiences reluctant to engage with it deeply. a discomfort that stems not from supernatural horror, but from its uncomfortably plausible portrayal of human capacity for evil. A particularly poignant piece of evidence emerged in 1971 when the great-granddaughter of Thomas Reading contacted the Savannah Historical Society. She had discovered among family heirlooms a small leather case containing several items: a pocket watch, a tarnished silver button, and a folded piece of paper with a brief note in what appeared to be Reading's handwriting. The note read simply, "Items belonging to those who cannot reclaim them. May they serve as proof that they existed and were remembered by someone." The button was identified as consistent with men's fashion from the 1830s, while the watch had an inscription on the interior reading "To James Sullivan from Father Boston, 1836. This matches the name of the tutor who, according to Reading's journal, was the first person to disappear into Eleanina's collection. These small personal items serve as perhaps the most tangible connection to the victims of the Howard estate. They remind us that behind the historical narrative and psychological analysis were real people with lives, families, and futures, all cut short by their fateful decision to accept an invitation from a seemingly respectable woman in rural Georgia. What happened to Eleanina Harwood after she relocated to Charleston remains largely unknown. City directories list her as residing at an address on Trad Street from 1843 until her death in 1859. Newspaper accounts describe her as reclusive and eccentric, but there is no evidence that she continued her collection of people in her new location. Perhaps the fire at the estate and the narrow escape from discovery had made her more cautious. Or perhaps, as some psychologists who have reviewed the case have suggested, her compulsion was tied specifically to the Harwood estate itself, to the power she held there as the undisputed mistress of a remote domain. Her death notice in the Charleston Mercury was brief, mentioning only that she was the daughter of the late Judge Harwood of Georgia, and that she had died after a brief illness. She left no children, and her remaining property was divided among distant relatives. None of her correspondence or personal papers from her Charleston years have survived, leaving a 16-year gap in our understanding of her life after leaving Georgia. This absence of information has led to speculation. Some have suggested that Eleanor might have continued her activities in a modified form, perhaps targeting slaves rather than white visitors to avoid the attention that would come with disappearances among her social class. Others propose that she might have channeled her controlling impulses into more socially acceptable forms of dominance, such as charitable work that allowed her to dictate the lives of the deserving poor. But without evidence, such theories remain speculation. The truth of Eleanina Harwood's final years died with her in 1859, buried in an unmarked grave in Charleston's St. Philip Cemetery. Local records indicate that despite her wealth, her funeral was sparsely attended and no epitaph was carved on her stone. Perhaps the most fitting postscript to the Harvard case came in 1973 when an elderly woman named Clara Mitchell was interviewed for a local history project in Savannah. Mitchell, then in her 90s, claimed that her grandmother had worked as a res for a family neighboring the Harwood estate. According to Mitchell, whenever her grandmother spoke of Eleanina Harwood, she would make a warning gesture and say simply, "Some people got a hunger that food can't satisfy." That hunger for control, for dominion, for the power to reshape human beings according to one's will lies at the heart of the Harwood case. It represents a particular manifestation of evil that feels at once historically distant and uncomfortably relevant to contemporary concerns about power and consent. In the marsh south of Savannah, few traces remain of the Harwood estate. Development has claimed much of the land, with suburban homes and shopping centers standing where rice fields once stretched to the horizon. But there is a small area approximately 15 miles south of the city that remains undeveloped, a patch of marshland that local builders reportedly avoid. A real estate agent interviewed for a 2012 article in the Savannah Morning News offered a practical explanation. The soil composition there is problematic for foundations. It's just not worth the engineering challenges when there's plenty of suitable land nearby. But older residents offer different explanations, speaking of bad feelings and heavy air. One elderly man, whose family had lived in the area for generations, put it more bluntly: "Some places remember what was done there. That marsh remembers what Miss Eleanina did to those poor souls." Whether one attributes such sentiments to superstition or to some more poetic understanding of how trauma leaves its mark on a landscape, they speak to a fundamental truth. The past is never entirely past. It lives on in records and recollections, in stories told and retold, in the reluctance to build where terrible things once occurred. The case of Elanina Harwood and her collection stands as a dark chapter in Georgia's history, one that official narratives have largely overlooked, but that survives in fragments of evidence and in the oral traditions of those whose ancestors witnessed the evil that unfolded at the edge of the marsh. It serves as a reminder that the elegant facades of Antebellum mansions, behind the romanticized images of southern plantations, there existed not just the institutional horror of slavery, but also more idiosyncratic evils. The private hells created by individuals who took the license granted by an unjust society and fashioned from it their own particular nightmares. In the whispering marsh grasses south of Savannah, in the gaps in official records, in journals discovered a century too late for justice to be done, the story of Elanina Harwood and her victims persists. A cautionary tale about what happens when power goes unchecked and when one person is granted dominion over another. As you drive along the coastal highway, you might pass the unmarked spot where the Harwood estate once stood. There is nothing there now to commemorate what happened. No historical marker, no memorial to those who entered through its grand doors and found themselves transformed from guests to possessions. Just the marsh, the wind, and perhaps, if some accounts are to be believed, an unnatural silence where birds refuse to sing. But for those who know the story, that absence speaks volumes. It reminds us that history is not just what we choose to remember and commemorate, but also what we choose to forget or what others have decided should be forgotten. In that forgetting, there is a second erasure of those who suffered, a continuation of the silencing that began when they were first taken into Elanina's collection. So perhaps the most fitting memorial is simply to remember, to acknowledge that Elanina Harwood existed, that her victims existed, that such horrors were possible within a society that allowed certain humans to own others, to recognize that the seeds of her particular evil were planted in the broader evil of her time, and to remain vigilant against the forms of dehumanization that might allow similar horrors to take root in our own. In the words Thomas Reading scratched into the final page of his journal before disappearing into history, I bear witness. Though no court may ever deliver justice, and though no stone may ever mark their graves, their story has been written. They lived, they suffered, and they will be remembered. As the sun sinks over the Georgia marshes, stretching long, somber shadows across the land where the Harwood estate once stood, we too are called to remember, to bear witness across the centuries to lives stolen by one woman's insatiable hunger for control. In that act of remembrance lies the only justice still possible for Eleanor Harwood's collection, the recognition that those she claimed were never hers to own. They were not objects, but people, not possessions, but souls, each with names, stories, and a humanity no cruelty could ever truly erase. The land remembers even when history chooses to forget, and now so do we.